Data tables are almost a backbone of robotic process automation. Almost every software robot you build will more than likely contain a data table. Data tables are simply data structures that live in memory, and they can hold structured data. And if you recall from my RPA overview course, RPA thrives on structured data. Essentially, they're like an Excel spreadsheet that you just can't see. They have rows that are labeled by ID like 1, 2, 3. They also have columns that can be labeled by ID like 1, 2, 3. Or they can have names in the header like first name, last name, email, and so on. We can add new rows to the data table as objects. And here you can see that there's curly braces around several values representing a specific human being. We can access cell data by examining a specific column of a row. And like I mentioned above, that column can be referenced by its name or an ID. It's often easier to access data from the cells when the columns do have names. It's easiest to create a data table by reading an Excel spreadsheet or by scraping a web table, but we'll be covering that in another section. It's also possible to create a data table using the build data table activity. So in this section, we'll be focusing on that, plus several other data table related activities. We'll also have an overview of all the data table activities, and specifically we'll talk about how to create and modify a data table structure. We will add rows to the data table. We will loop through the rows of a data table and examine some cell values. And finally, we'll talk about deleting a data table row as well. And as you'll soon discover, that's not quite as easy as it sounds. So let's jump right into it. In this video, we'll take a quick tour of all the data table activities. I'll start by creating a new blank project called Data Tables. Click on Create. I'll jump into my Activities pane here and type in the word Table. You can see that that leaves us with 3 relevant sections. App Integration, which has Excel tables. System, which has a File, Workbook, Get Table Range. And then finally the Programming section that has this data table subsection with all of our data table activities. These are the activities we're interested in for this section. So we'll walk through the most obvious ones here. We're going to start by using build data table, which is going to allow us to create a data table according to a specified schema. And that's basically a graphical UI that allows us to add columns of specified data types. Then we'll use the add data row activity to put data into our data table. And then we'll use for each row to loop through the rows of our data table. And we'll use get row item to examine a particular cell from a given row. And then we'll use remove data row to delete a row. Notice we also have things like clear a data table and generate data table. This one is kind of interesting because it allows you to point the activity at a blob of semi-unstructured data and specify what the column separators are and what the row separators are, and it will automatically detect and generate a data table for you. You can also utilize an OCR option for this activity. We can merge 2 data tables, and you can see here that we're going to have choices about how to handle missing schema information between the 2 data tables. We can output a data table, which simply means to write it to a CSV format. We also have the ability to add data columns or remove data columns if we want to programmatically change the schema of our data table while the robot is running. So as you can imagine, that allows us to build up a data table dynamically if we want to. There are other activities that are directly related to data tables, but we're going to talk about those in a different section. If I type in the word range, you'll see that we have App Integration Excel. And if we use this read range activity, we can actually read in an Excel spreadsheet, which will result in the creation of a data table. And the same thing works down here in the more generic System File Workbook read range or get table range. Both of these write ranges are going to take a data table as input as well. So those are some hints for you about future Excel and spreadsheet lectures. For now, let's get started with the basics and learn how to create our own data table. In this lecture, I'd like to talk about how to create and also modify a data table structure. I've got my data table project open that we created in the previous lecture, and from activities, I will first grab a sequence and drag that onto my canvas so we can do multiple data table related things. So I'll go back in here to my table, and I'm going to grab this build data table activity and click and drag that into my sequence. And just out of habit, I'm going to rename the sequence to data table stuff. So this build data table activity is going to allow us to build that invisible Excel spreadsheet that I was talking about. And one of the most important things you need to know about it is that the output is going to be a variable. And that variable is of type data table. So the same way we create any other variable, I'll right click here and select create variable, and I'll just call this my data table and hit return. So now down here in variables, I've got a new variable called my data table. Like I mentioned, the type is data table and the scope is data table stuff, which is this sequence. Interestingly, I can add a default value here, but there's probably not going to be much value for us to do that at this point. So I'll hide my variables tab here. And the way we build a data table is by clicking on this data table button, which pops up a window that's resizable and has two default columns in it. You can't right click on these things and rename them. They're really just there for a demonstration. So the first thing you'll always do is click on these remove column buttons to delete them. Now we need to use this plus button over here to add a new column. When I click on this, I have yet another resizable window, and this allows me to type in column name and some other data about each column. So for this sample, we'll just build a simple users table. So I'll call this first column first name, and unlike something like SQL Server, UiPath is pretty flexible about the header names, so I can use a space there if I want to. And notice I'm not using quotes around this. First name is going to be a string. For the most part, I am going to allow nulls because by unchecking this, you're certainly going to increase the number of possible errors you'll get in your robot due to a table not having a value for a particular cell. But that's a more advanced topic. We'll get to that in future videos. I don't expect to have a default value for my first name. First names will not be unique. And for max length here, I'm going to leave it as -1 because that's going to give me an unlimited amount of space for each name. If you have more stringent data requirements, feel free to not allow nulls, make things unique, and set your lengths accordingly. I'll just click on OK to create my first column. I'll click plus one more time to add in my last name column, which is also a string. I will also allow nulls and accept all the defaults. Clicking plus, I'll add in an age column. And int32 is probably a little big for ages, because if you know from my Tech Primer course, int32 can store numbers much larger than the 100 or so that we need for a human age. But in doing so, it's going to consume more memory. So I can browse for types here, type in int32 to find it, and notice in MS Core Lib system, that's where it lives. So I can back out that 32 and type in system.int, and that took us right down to the collection of possible integer data types. Let's go with int16 and click OK. The rest of these defaults are fine. I'll click OK. And maybe one more column for email address, which is a string. And maybe we'll go ahead and click on this unique checkbox so that our table will throw an error when any users have the same email address, because the robot's going to want to handle that. So I click on OK, and I've got my 4 columns. What's important to know about this build data table UI is that I can no longer go back and rename any of these columns or drag them to reorder them at all. What I've entered here is fixed. I will be able to come back and click on Add Column, but that's always going to go at the end of the schema. And I think they do that to prevent problems because the Add Data Row activity is going to provide values for columns in a specified order. So if you come along and change the order of these columns, that could break your Add Data Row activities. So notice that we do have the ability to add in data by clicking on these rows and typing some information in. I don't usually do that because I build up my data rows dynamically when the robot's running. But you can mess around with that if you want to. So I'll click OK, and we've got our data table. Control S to save. When you want to come back and modify this table, it's a simple matter of clicking on this data table button again. But just remember that you can't rename these columns, nor can you insert new columns between them. You can delete columns, and of course click on this plus to add a new column, which is always going to go at the end of the list. So that's it. We've created a data table. In the next lecture, we'll look at how to insert items into this data table programmatically. In the previous video, I talked about the fact that when you use build data table, you're not able to edit the columns. I'm excited to tell you that as of UiPath version 2018.3, they've now added the ability to go back and edit the column names and types. And not only that, you can click and drag to reorder them within the UI. Again, this can only be done in more recent versions of UiPath. And like I said, if you want to edit a column, simply click on this pencil and you can change the column name, type, and all the other values that we had access to when we were creating the column. Honestly, there's no real risk to doing this because there's not usually data in your data table. We do have the ability to add data rows when we build the data table. So in some cases, changing the type might delete your data or change it. But for most of the processes I've built, I usually create the data table structure and then either do some data scraping from a web application, or I read an Excel file, or query a database or something like that. So anyway, great news that we can edit our data table columns and drag and drop to reorder them. I'm not sure exactly which version this came in, but for certain, 2018.3 has this feature. So enjoy it, I sure will. In a previous lecture, we used an activity to create a data table. Now let's try to add rows to that data table. Adding rows to a data table is pretty simple. We'll go to Activities, type in Table, grab this Add Data Row activity, and drag it into our sequence. The first thing we're going to want to supply over here in the Properties pane is which data table we're going to add the data row to. So for that, we click on our data table, copy the data table name, select our data row activity, and paste in that data table name there. To actually add the row data, we need to make sure that we know how many columns there are and what data types. So clicking on this data table button, we can see that we've got a first name, last name, both of which are strings. Then we've got this age, which is a number, and our email address, which is also a string. So add data row allows us to either pass in a data row object or an array of objects. I'm going to choose this first option for now. So I'll click on these three dots, and the way we can specify an array is to simply open up some curly braces. And now we just type in the values that we want for our row. So for the first name string, I'll open some double quotes and type in Brian. Then I'll go to the end and hit a comma, open another double quote. Last name is Lamb. Move to the end of that, comma again. Type in an age value, and since this is an integer, I will not use quotes around it. One more comma, open my quotes, and type in an email address. That's it. When I click on OK, now that activity is going to write that data into the data table when the robot runs. You're most commonly going to build up a data table by reading an Excel file or scraping data from an HTML table on a website. If you're going to use these add data row, you're most likely going to do it in the context of some kind of a loop. For now though, I'll just Control-C and Control-V to add one more data row, and I'll click here to change the data to a different value. Change the age to 30, and we'll just say john@smith.com. So now my expectation is, if I was to run this robot, my data table would be created and 2 data rows would be added to it. It's that simple to add data rows to your data table. And I'll just mention that in this expression editor here, you can absolutely use variables in here instead of literal strings. So again, if you already had some variables in place and you were using a loop to populate your database, there are many different possibilities for where you would get these values for your add data row activity. But hopefully that gives you some ideas for how you can build up your own data tables to manage information in your software robots. Now that we've created a data table and added rows to it, it's time to loop through those rows and examine cell values. It shouldn't come as much of a surprise that to loop through our data, we're going to use this for each row activity. So I'll click and drag that after my add data row activities. And you can see the syntax here is for each row in these rows, we're going to do something. So all I need to do here is supply the name of my data table, because those are the rows. So I'll click on my data table, grab that data table name, and paste it in here. So again, we get this word row by default, but if you want to, you can change that to user, since our data table has users in it. So now we're saying for each user in my data table, do something. I'm simply going to use log message to demonstrate this. So I'll click on a log message and drag and drop that into our body. What I'm going to do is I'm going to log each of these users so they show up down here in the output section. The syntax we can use for that, I'll just open some double quotes and type current user :space. And then here I'll use a plus to concatenate the various attributes of our user. And the syntax we can use to grab the cell values from this user row is I can type in user dot item. Notice I'm using a capital I there. And then I open up my parentheses. And since when we built our data table, we utilized header names for our columns, I can open up some double quotes and type in first name, exactly the way I spelled it when we were building the data table. Since this is going to get long, I'll jump over here to the message and click on these three dots so we can see it better. So I'm concatenating the user's first name to this string. Now I'll use another plus, open my quotes, and put in a space that's going to be between the first name and the last name. One more plus. Now I'll type in user again, dot, item, same as before, open my parentheses. And for those of you who have done some programming before, you might notice that this little IntelliSense window pops up, giving me some different signature options. So you can see I can provide a column as a data column, or I can provide a column name as a string. That's the one I'm currently using. And by the way that I'm changing these things is using my up and down arrows on the keyboard. I could provide a column index, which is the actual number of the column. I could provide a column as a data column. Again, column name is string plus the version, and column index plus the version as well. So I'm going to stick to number 2 here, which is column name as string. So I open quotes again, type in last name, and for speed, I'm just going to go ahead and copy this whole thing. Control-C to copy, Control-V to paste, put in that space, and now this time we're going to be using user item.age, and I'll paste it in one more time, and as I recall, this one was email address. I'll click on OK and go back and double check that. First name, last name, age, email address. And notice we're getting a warning here where it says that it's prohibiting operands on type object for operator plus. So what that means is we need to use .toString to convert these generic objects into strings. So let's jump back in here with the 3 dots. And right next to this closing parenthesis, we'll type in .toString, hit tab, and I'm going to go ahead and copy that and paste it at the end of each of these little phrases. So even though the age in the database is an int 16, it's going to be converted to a string when we concatenate all these values together. So let's click OK and see what happens. To summarize, we are building a data table, adding 2 rows, and then we're using this for loop to say for each user row in the data table, log the message and concatenate all the cell values. So let's run it and see what happens. The robot is back. I click output, and there we go. Notice that it wrote out an empty user and then my 2 values. I think I know why that happened. Let's go look. When we built the data table, you may recall that it offers us the ability to supply data rows right here in the data table builder. I forgot to delete those, so I'm going to click on this first remove row to delete that. This one always stays here in case I want to add data to the table. So let's click OK and run again. In the output, now you can see we only have those 2 users. So there you go. It's that easy to create the data table, add rows, and iterate through the values. I want to point out that instead of directly accessing the user items in this log message, we could also have gone into our activities inside the table activities and used getRowItem. this will get a value from a data row variable according to a specified column. So let's quickly see how this works before we close this video. So I'll click and drag that in before my log message, and let's explore the properties. You can see it's asking for a row, and that's going to be a data row object. So that's going to be user. I'll Control-C on that and paste that in for the row. And now we can see that we could pass in a column or a column index or a column name to determine what's going to get pulled out of this user row. So if I hover over a column name, it's just saying the name of the column whose value is to be retrieved. So that's easy enough. I'll open some quotes, type in first name, because that's the name of one of my columns. And where are we going to put that data value? Right here. We right click, say create variable, and we'll call this first name and hit return. So now, as you might expect, we've got a first name variable whose scope is body, which is the sequence right here, and it's a generic value, which is fine. So this get row item activity is taking in this user row, which we got from our loop. It's going to grab the value from the first name column and put that into the first name variable. So that allows me down here in my log message to, instead of using this user item.firstName to string, I can simply type in that variable from above, firstName.toString. So in that way, we could have used getRowItem activities to pull out all the values and store them into variables instead of referencing them by user item column name. Hopefully that makes sense. Let's run it again and make sure it works. In the output, we have the exact same thing. So that's great. We have two different ways to get information from our data table rows. GetRowItem, or directly using item with a column name or a column index. In the previous lecture, I showed you how to loop through a data table. For those of you that understand databases, or if you've taken my Tech Primer course and seen how we can do database queries, ultimately a huge value of having a data table in the first place is being able to run queries on it. So let's take a quick look at what it looks like to query a data table instead of looping through it. For the sake of time, I'm using a project that starts with the same data table we created in the previous lecture. It has a first name column with string, last name column string, age of int 16, and email address. I'm going to add the same three data rows: Brian Lamb, age 50, John Smith, age 30, John Jones, age 35. So the end result is going to be a data table saved in this variable called myDataTable, which, as you recall, is a data table variable type. In the last lecture, I used for each, but I used the for each row activity to loop through the rows of my data table. It's not the right thing to use for this lecture, but I'm going to use it to show you how this exercise is similar to the last exercise, but we do need to modify a little bit. So like before, I'm going to click on my data table and grab that data table variable and paste it in right here. So our goal is to loop through each row of the data table. I'll change this to user like we did last time to reflect the fact that we are looping through a data table that has the users in it. We don't have to do that, but that just makes it more readable. Then in the body, I'm simply going to use a log message again and log these into our output section. Here in the message, I'll open this up and paste in exactly what we were using before, which is to say that our current user, and then we'll concatenate this user.item with column names. So user.item first name, user.item last name, and so on, just so we're going to display each user down here in the output. So far we haven't done anything different than the previous lecture. Let's run it and watch. So down here in the output, we see all three rows as expected. So here is where the change comes in. Right now, we're looping through all rows of this data table. What if we wanted to be particular about which rows we wanted to loop or log or write into an Excel file? The way we do that is by using this data table variables select method. And that's a .NET method we can access by typing in .sel, and you can see there it is, select. So when I double click on that, I would open up some parentheses to type in my parameters. And notice we have 4 different overloads. And again, overloads are described in more detail in the Tech Primer course. The first overload gives us a filter expression, which is a string, and notice it's going to return us an array of data rows. Using my down arrow key on the keyboard, I can see the second overload has a filter expression, which is a string, but also a sort expression as a string, and it's also returning an array of data rows. Down arrow key to see my third overload. Now we're talking about a filter expression, a sort expression, and record states, and the fourth overload is simply the method with no parameters, which is going to return all rows. But again, it's an array of data rows, so if I don't pass anything in and just click away, notice I've got this error. And it says, hey, I can't convert this array of data rows to a system.data.data table. And what that means is if we pass in a data table by itself, that's what this activity is expecting, because it does for each row of a data table. However, when we tack on that select method, we're getting back an array of data rows, which is not a data table. So that makes this for each row activity unhappy. So what we can do to solve this problem is jump into activities, type in for each, and just grab a normal workflow control flow for each instead of this programming data table for each row. So I'll grab this for each and drag it out here, and I'm going to copy this log message and paste it into the body here. And since this is a separate activity with its own variable scope, I can change item to user like we did before. I could go ahead and paste in my data table by itself without the select on there. And notice this guy is complaining here. And when you hover over it, it says, hey, I can't convert this data table to a collection of I enumerables. So what that's telling us is that unlike this collection that was expecting a data table, this guy up here is expecting one of these kind of objects over here. And as it turns out, right in this collection, it's offering us data row. So if I select that guy, and then I add my dot select on here, and hit tab, and add my parentheses, this method is returning an array of data rows, which is exactly what this activity is expecting. So when I click away, my errors are gone. And as you recall, using this select method with no parameters on my data table is going to return all rows. So if I jump down here and delete this old one, right-click to delete, and run the robot again now, looking at the output, we've got the exact same output. So at this point, you're probably wondering, why the heck did we do that? Well, what this does is it gives us the power to do queries against our data table. And what that means is if I click inside these parentheses here, you may recall if I delete one and open it up again, my first overload allows me to put in a filter expression as a string. So I'll type in a double quote to open my query and a double quote to close it. And so you can see it better, I'm going to jump over here into this values and open this up into a bigger window. What we can do is we can specify a column name that we'd like to use for filtering our data table. You may recall that our data table has an age column, so I'll type in age space less than 50. What this allows us to do is select only the users whose age is lower than 50. When I click OK and run the robot, you see now it only comes back with 2 rows, and it's only the users whose ages are less than 50 years old. So hopefully now you're seeing the power of being able to perform queries on your data table. If I jump back in there and do something like this, where I open my square bracket and say last name and close my square bracket, space equals, and then I already have double quotes for this string, so I'm going to open up with a single quote, type in lamb, and then close with a single quote. So now I'm saying select all rows where the last name column equals lamb, and click OK. Run the robot, click output, and what do you know? One row with my name in it. When I click in here and open this up, there's a second override we can provide. And the way we do that is by clicking on the double quotes after this first parameter and hitting a comma. So now you can see this sort expression as string is bold, so we know we're typing this one in. So I'll add a space, open my double quote, and say age, and then either ASC or DESC. I'm going to go back and change this one to age less than 50 like we did before. So now my first parameter is saying get me all the rows who have an age of less than 50. And oh, by the way, I want you to sort them by age ascending. And each of these are separate strings separated by a comma. So I click OK and run the robot. In my output, I've got 2 rows, both under 50, and they are in ascending order, age 30, age 35. When I click output, when I jump back in here and change that filter to DESC, which is short for descending, and click OK and run the robot, now I have the same 2 rows, but they're in descending order this time, 35 and 30. So hopefully this helps you understand that you do have the ability to perform queries on your data tables when you're moving information from system A to system B, or from one Excel file to another Excel file, and so on. Just remember, if you did use a column that has a space in it, that you need to use these square brackets around the column. And now this time we're going to sort by last name, descending in alphabetical order. Click OK, run the robot. And you can see that alphabetically, Smith and Jones are sorted in descending order by last name. In the previous videos, we have created a data table, added rows, looped through the rows, and examined the contents. Now let's go ahead and see how to delete a table row. Here inside the robot, I'm building a table and adding 2 rows. So let's go ahead and copy and paste that row and add one that we can delete. So for first name, I'll just say delete. Second name, me. So now we're going to have 3 rows in our database. And inside here in the for each, I'm going to leave this for each row as it is, and I'll Control C to copy it and paste it one more time here. So now we're going to loop through our data table 2 times, but in this first one, after I log the message, I'm going to go into my activities here and use remove data row and drop it right there. So as usual, it's asking me which data table are we going to delete from. So that's this guy right here, my data table. I'll paste that in. It's asking which row do we want to delete. If I had the row index, I could pass that in, but we conveniently already have the row right here. So I'll copy my user value there and supply that right here. And that's it. I'm going to delete that current row. The only problem with this approach is that it's going to delete all the rows. So what we need to do is wrap this with a conditional. So I'll jump into activities, type if, and grab this if block and drag it in above remove data row. So now I'll grab this remove data row and drop it in here because I'm going to do a test. I'm going to say if first name, which is that variable that I created right up here in get row item, I'll say if first name dot toString, since first name is a generic data type, then I'll type in dot contains, and then open some parentheses, open my quotes, and type the word delete, because that's the one we were looking for. Only if this is true will it go in here and remove that data row. So the way this is going to run is it will build our data table, add 3 rows, the last of which contains delete as the first name. Then it's going to start looping through each user row of that table. It'll get the first name, it will write out a log message with all 4 values, and then if the first name value contains delete, it's going to remove that row, and then it will proceed to again loop through my data table and spit the items out. So my expectation is we'll get 3 records here down in the output, followed by 2 records here. Let's run it and see. We got an error, and this is to be expected because remember we made our email address constrained to be unique. So that's a simple fix. I can just jump up here to my delete, click on the array row values, and change this to Jones. So what happened there is, since these 2 had the same email address, the robot complained that they were duplicates. And we could have handled that with a try-catch block and reported it if we need to. We're not interested in doing that yet, so I'll click on OK. and run the robot again. So this is the real error that I wanted to show you. The source is for each row, collection was modified, enumeration operation might not execute. The reason for this error is that when you're iterating a database like this iterator is keeping track of a version of the data table. And when you try to delete stuff from within the iteration, it gets confused. So we have to take a different approach to deleting a row instead of doing it inside a for each row activity. So here's the process. The first thing I'll do is drag this if outside of that for each. And of course now remove data row is complaining because user is no longer valid. That's fine, we'll fix that in a minute. So above my if statement, I'm going to grab and assign and click and drag that in up here. And we're going to assign to a new variable we create, and we'll call it rows to delete. Hit return and jump down to my variables tab, and we're going to click on the variable type here to change it. And you can't see it, but I'm going down to browse for types, and I'll type in system.collections.generic, and inside our usual MS Core lib here, I'll expand this, and we want this list. And what kind of a list of T? I'll click on this menu and select system.data.dataRow and click OK. So you can see now that I've set my rows to delete as a list of data row. So clearly this is kind of an advanced topic. And this is why business people can often benefit from having an IT person helping them build robots. So I'll hide my variables pane. So now that we have our rows to delete variable set up as a list of data rows, we need to initialize it. So I'll click these three dots to expand this window, and we're going to initialize it to a new list, and then we open up parentheses of system.data.dataRow. So that's just going to give us an empty list of data rows. Now I'm going to jump back over to activities, type in table again, and grab one more of these for each row, and I'll click and drag that out here. And I'm basically going to do the same thing as I did up here. Instead of using user, I'll just leave it as row, but I'm going to use that same data table. So for each row in my data table. Now this time, I'm going to drag my if into that body again. But since we're no longer inside this one where we have our first name variable, I've got to do something different here. This time I'm going to grab this row value and paste that here. And I'll open parentheses after row there, and then open some double quotes and use my column name of first name. And then I'll jump to the end and say dot equals, and that's where I can open up my parentheses and quotes again and use that word delete that we put up here inside this third data row for the first name. So for each row in my data table, if the first name row equals delete, instead of remove data row, I'm going to drag that out of here. I'm going to use an activity called add to collection. So I'll click and drag that in here instead. And what we're going to do is we're going to add this row to this list of data rows we created up here. So I'll copy that value and paste that into the collection field in my properties pane. And the item we're going to add is a data row. That's this one right here. And I'll tab away to set that. And here's the important part. We need to make sure that for this add to collection, it's aware of what type we're trying to add. So I need to jump in here and make sure we also select system.data.dataRow. So now that we've added that row to the collection of rows, we can finally do our delete. But in order to do it, we've got to use a traditional for each. And that's this one right here. Notice I'm not using the for each row like we used before. I'm going to use this for each and drag that right here. And we're going to go for each item in this list of rows we've been building up. Paste that here. Now we can finally delete that row. So now we're iterating on rows to delete And for this remove data row activity, we can leave my data table because that's the table from which we're trying to delete a row. But in this case, the row is not going to be user. It's going to be this item right here. So I'll select my remove data row, paste in item there, and notice when I paste that in, it's complaining because on this for each, when I select this guy, we need to make sure that we change the type argument that we're iterating on to system.data.dataRow. And now all the errors go away, and we're ready to delete our row. After that, we're going to again iterate through our data table and display the remaining rows. So to summarize here, we build our data table, we add 3 rows, then we iterate through the rows and display them, then we create a new list of data rows, and we iterate through our data table again, looking for the one that says delete. And when we find that, we add that to our list of rows. Then we iterate through that list of rows, which only has 1 item in it. We remove that row. And this is what allows us to bypass that error we saw before. And now finally, we iterate on the rows again, and there should only be 2 left. So let's finally run this robot and see if it works. Notice we didn't get any errors. We go down to our output field here, and the first time it goes through, it has Brian, John, and delete. And the second time, just Brian and John. So mission accomplished, we've deleted a row from our data table. Just bear in mind that you can't do a delete from within the for each row. You've got to create a list of rows and then put any rows you want to delete inside that list. Use a traditional for each to remove the data rows from that original table, and you should be good to go. Clearly, this is an advanced topic that I wouldn't expect most business users to be able to accomplish. But hopefully this video helps.